She had been bringing him food every Tuesday for 3 years, and the whole town thought it was charity. It wasn't. It was something neither of them had a word for yet. And that was the problem. Because now Daniel Grant was standing on her porch with flowers and a future the whole of Durango had already decided was hers, and Nathan Cole was across 2 fields and a fence line, stacking hay alone in the dark like a man who had already made up his mind to disappear. Eliza Harper had spent 25 years building something real on broken ground. She wasn't about to let the wrong person inherit it. Like the story, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning Eliza Harper turned 25, she did not celebrate. She woke before the sun, pulled on her boots in the dark, and walked out to check the east fence line because 2 of the posts had been leaning wrong all week, and she didn't trust them to hold through another night of wind. That was how she measured her days, not by what she wanted, but by what needed doing. The ranch didn't care that it was her birthday. The cattle didn't care. The Colorado sky certainly didn't care, wide and pale gray in the early hours, spreading itself out over the San Juan Mountains like something that had never once been asked what it thought about anything. She found the fence worse than she expected. 1 post had gone clean over, dragging the wire with it, and 2 of the cattle had wandered to the edge of the property, standing near the creek with the particular stupidity of animals who don't understand they've done something wrong. Eliza got them back, reset the post herself using a rock in a bad mood, and was back in the house by 7 with mud on her elbows and no one to tell about it. That was fine. That was how it had been since her father died 4 years ago and left her the land, the debt, and a handshake agreement with the bank that she had honored every single month since. She wasn't looking for pity. She had taken what was given and made it work, which was more than most people around Durango could say about anything. She made coffee, ate standing up at the counter, and watched the sun finally come over the ridge and hit the fields in long orange stripes. It was a Tuesday, which meant she would be cooking extra at supper. Nathan Cole's place was about a quarter-mile east, across 2 pastures and a low wooden fence that had been there so long nobody remembered who had built it. His land ran bigger than hers and had better water access, but the house itself looked tired. Not neglected exactly, but worn in the way things get when no one is looking after the details anymore. The window frames could use painting. The porch steps had a soft spot in the middle board. Little things that added up. Nathan was 55 years old and had been working cattle in Colorado for most of his life. He was not a tall man, but he was built in a way that communicated solidity, wide across the shoulders, hands that looked like they had been useful for decades, a face that didn't show much but that paid attention. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years ago of a fever that came fast and left no room for goodbyes. The town had brought food and condolences for about 2 weeks and then moved on, the way towns do, and Nathan had gone back to work because there was nothing else to do with the shape of what was missing. He had a hired hand, a young man named Cody who was 19 and good with horses and useless at conversation, which suited Nathan fine. They worked the property in a kind of productive silence most days. Nathan didn't eat well. He knew he didn't eat well. He just couldn't manufacture the motivation to cook a real meal for one person at the end of a long day. It felt like too much of an admission. Eliza had figured this out within about 6 months of being his neighbor on her own, and she had started bringing food. Not every night, just Tuesdays when she made a bigger pot of whatever she was making anyway, and she brought the extra across the fields in a covered pot and left it on his porch if he wasn't visible, or handed it to him directly if he was. She never called it anything. She never said, "I thought you might need this," or "I'm worried about you." She just set it down and said something about the weather or asked about his north pasture and then went home. Nathan accepted this without comment for the first month, then said thank you one evening in a tone that was slightly embarrassed, and she had waved it off and left. And after that, they didn't discuss it. It became part of the week. He started washing the pots and leaving them on his fence post so she could pick them up without having to knock. She started leaving a second cloth napkin folded on top in case he needed it, which he always did. This had been going on for 3 years. Durango was the kind of frontier town that had strong opinions about its residents and not enough other business to distract itself from them. It had grown over the past decade into something more established. A proper main street, a bank, a dry goods operation run by the Grant family, a church. a saloon that the church pretended not to notice. There were maybe 400 people living in and around the town proper, and they all knew each other's situations with the casual intimacy of people who have limited entertainment options. Eliza Harper was a topic of ongoing gentle concern for a certain subset of Durango's population, namely, the women who had decided she needed guidance. She was young, they said. She was pretty, they said, in that serious way that made men nervous, with dark hair and green eyes and the kind of posture that came from carrying things. She was running that ranch alone, which was admirable in a way, but surely she understood that a woman needed a partner, a proper one, not just some hired help and a stubborn streak. Surely she could see that the smart move, the practical move, the move that made sense for her future, was to find a good man and build something together. Daniel Grant had become the answer to this particular question. He was 28, the younger son of Thomas Grant, who ran the dry goods business, and he had recently returned to Durango after 2 years in Denver, where he had apparently learned things about commerce and civilization that made him something of a catch by local standards. He was handsome in an easy way, with good clothes and good manners, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to fight very hard for anything. He was not a bad man. He was pleasant and generous and genuinely well-liked. He had simply decided, after looking around Durango for about 3 weeks, that Eliza Harper was the most interesting woman in the county, and he had begun to pursue her with the same methodical optimism he applied to everything. He had brought her flowers twice. He had arranged to sit near her at the Sunday social. He had offered to look at her fence situation, which she had politely declined. He had asked her to dinner once, and she had said she was busy, and he had said next week then, and she had said maybe, and he had taken that as a yes. The town watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. It made sense. It was tidy. Daniel Grant and Eliza Harper. Good families, good land, a practical match. People said so openly. People said it to Eliza directly, in the pleasant way people say things they assume you agree with. She smiled and didn't answer, which they interpreted as modesty. The Tuesday in early October when things started to shift was not especially different from any other Tuesday, at least not on the surface. Eliza had cooked a beef stew that had turned out better than expected. She'd found some dried herbs she'd forgotten about, and the broth had gone darker and richer than usual. She covered the pot and set out across the pasture in the late afternoon, the grass already going dry and gold under the October sky, the mountains cutting a sharp line to the west where the sun was starting to drop. She found Nathan at the fence line on the east side of his property, working on a section of wire that had pulled loose. He was doing it alone because Cody had gone into town for something, and he had already restretched about 40 feet of it by himself, using a fence stretcher in what appeared to be a considerable amount of frustration. "That bad?" she said. He looked up. He had a smear of rust on one forearm and the look of a man who had been out here long enough that the sun was no longer his friend. "Third time this section's gone," he said. "Ground shifts in the fall. Posts don't hold." "You need to go deeper on these," she said, setting the pot down on the ground and coming to look. 2 feet isn't enough in this soil. My father had the same problem on the south side. He went down to 3 and put a rock layer in." Nathan looked at the post, then at her. "That's not fast." "No," she agreed, "but it works." He crouched down, looking at the base of the post, and she crouched next to him, and for a moment they were both just looking at the ground together, the way people do when they're thinking about a problem. The light was going orange and sideways across the field, and there were no other sounds except the distant lowing of cattle and the wind in the dry grass. "I brought stew," she said. "I can smell it from here." He stood up, rolling the tension in his shoulder. "It's going to be dark before I finish this. Leave it till morning. You'll see it better." He looked like he was going to argue, which was his habit, and then didn't, which was the other habit he had developed lately. All right. They walked back to his house, which was slower than walking alone because Nathan's knee had been giving him trouble, and he didn't talk about it, but she had noticed the way he came down off the porch steps. She didn't say anything about it. That would embarrass him and accomplish nothing. He heated the stew on the stove and she sat at his kitchen table, which was a thing she had started doing about a year ago without either of them really deciding it. She'd bring the food, he'd heat it, and they'd sit there while it warmed up and talk about property things, grass conditions, market prices, which ranchers were selling, what the weather was supposed to do. Practical conversation. the kind that required knowing something before you could contribute to it, which meant it was honest. Grant's boy came out to your place, Nathan said, not looking at her. He was watching the stove. He did, she said. Again. Yes. There was a pause. He stirred the pot once. Town seems to think that's a good arrangement. Town thinks a lot of things. Nathan set the spoon down and turned around, leaning against the stove with his arms crossed, and looked at her with the direct expression he had when he was actually going to say something instead of circling around it. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned that pushing him produced nothing useful. He's a good prospect, Nathan said finally. That family has money. He's got time ahead of him. He'd be able to help with the property. I don't need help with the property, she said. I've been managing it. I know you have. Then why are you telling me about Daniel Grant's prospects like I'm making a business decision? He looked at her for another moment, then turned back to the stove. Just saying what people are saying. She let that sit there between them for a minute, listening to the stew start to bubble. What do you think? She asked. He didn't answer right away. He got 2 bowls from the shelf and filled them, brought them to the table, sat down across from her. He had big hands, she noticed again. The kind of hands that were always doing something even when they were still, and they wrapped around the bowl like it was something that needed steadying. I think it's not my business, he said. I asked anyway. He looked at her. The light in his kitchen came from one lamp on the counter, and it didn't flatter anything, just showed what was there. The lines in his face, the gray at his temples, the way he was looking at her like he was trying to figure out what the correct answer was and coming up empty. I think you should do whatever's right for you, he said. That's all. She picked up her spoon. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. They ate in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that had texture to it, that meant something had been said even in the not saying. She stayed until the bowls were empty, and then she rinsed them in his sink and took the pot. The post on the north corner, she said at the door. Go 3 feet. Rock layer at the bottom. It'll hold. I know, he said. She nodded and went back across the fields in the dark, which she had done often enough that she didn't need a lantern. She knew the ground. The next Sunday social was the one where Daniel sat next to her at the table, and everything seemed to accelerate in a way she hadn't asked for. The socials happened in the church hall every 2 weeks, and attendance was not exactly voluntary if you wanted to remain in good standing with the community, which Eliza mostly did because she relied on that community for trading and labor agreements and the particular kind of help that only comes from people who feel connected to you. So she went, and she ate the food that the women brought and answered questions about her cattle operation and endured the conversation. Daniel was at his best at events like this. He was warm and funny and attentive, and he had a gift for making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room, which Eliza recognized as both genuine and practiced, which was an interesting combination. He brought her a plate without asking if she wanted one. He refilled her water. He laughed at the right moments and didn't dominate every conversation. I've been thinking about expanding the dry goods operation, he said to her at one point. My father's been talking about a second location, maybe in Silverton. There's opportunity up there. That's a difficult route in winter, she said. I know, but risk and opportunity tend to travel together. He smiled. You'd understand that better than most. Running that ranch alone, that took real courage. It took work, she said. Courage is probably giving it too much credit. He laughed like she had said something charming which she hadn't intended. You always do that, he said. You minimize yourself. I don't think I do, she said, and she said it evenly, and he looked at her for a moment like he was recalibrating. No, he said, maybe you don't. And he seemed to actually hear her for once, which she gave him credit for. Across the room, Nathan had come in late and was standing near the wall with a cup of something, talking to old Ben Marsh about whatever it was they always talked about. He hadn't dressed up exactly, but he'd put on a clean shirt and his hair was combed, which was about as formal as Nathan got. He glanced over once and she caught it, just for a second, and then he looked away at the window. She watched him for a moment, the way he stood, easy and still, not performing for anyone, not trying to be anything in particular. She had known him for 4 years now. She had watched him work in the rain because the work needed doing. She had watched him make decisions about his cattle that were right even when they cost him money. She had watched him be decent to Cody, who had no family in the area and no one else looking out for him, in ways that Nathan would have been embarrassed to have acknowledged. "Eliza," Daniel said. "Sorry," she said. "I was thinking about something." "What can I compete with?" he said, smiling, making it a joke. She smiled back, but it didn't reach very far. Now, in November, the first real cold came down off the mountains and changed everything about how the land operated. The cattle needed more attention. The water sources had to be checked daily against freezing. The workload on a one-woman ranch in November was the kind that left you sitting at the kitchen table at the end of the day, too tired to stand up again. Eliza managed it the way she managed everything, which was by starting earlier and stopping later. But there was a day in the middle of the month when she was trying to get a section of trough patched before dark, and the sealant she was using wasn't holding, and the temperature was dropping, and she had been at it for an hour, and it was not working. And she was cold and frustrated and alone, and she sat back on her heels in the mud and just stopped for a minute, hands in her lap, staring at the broken trough. She heard boots in the grass before she saw him. Nathan came around the corner of the outbuilding with a different kind of sealant in his hand. The pine tar compound her father used to use, which she hadn't thought of, and he didn't say anything, just crouched down next to her and looked at the trough. "Pine tar'll hold in the cold," he said. "What you're using won't." "I know that now," she said. "You started working on it without being asked." She watched him for a moment and then moved to help, and they worked together in silence until it was done, which took about 20 minutes. When he stood up, he offered her his hand to help her up, which he had never done before, and she took it, and he pulled her up without effort, and they stood there for a second closer than they usually were, which happened sometimes when there was work that required proximity. "How'd you know to come?" she said. "Saw you fighting with it from across the way." She nodded. "Thank you." "You'd have figured it out," he said. "Eventually." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, which with Nathan was the same thing. He handed her the compound. "Keep this. I've got more." She held the tin and watched him walk back across the field in the fading light, not rushing, just walking with that particular unhurried solidity that she had decided a long time ago was the most honest way a person could move through the world. She stood there longer than made sense, holding the tin, the cold coming down, the light going. It was Marta Blevins who finally said it out loud, which was fitting because Marta Blevins said most things out loud that other people kept to lower volumes. Marta was 60, ran the post office with her husband, and had the social instincts of a hawk. She cornered Eliza one morning in December outside the dry goods store and cut directly to it. "You're not going to take up with Daniel Grant, are you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Eliza looked at her. "Good morning to you too, Marta." "Don't give me that. I've been watching you for 2 months. Every time that boy gets close to you, you go somewhere else in your head." Marta crossed her arms against the cold. "It's coal, isn't it?" Eliza felt something shift very carefully in her chest, the way ice does when it starts to move. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You bring that man food every Tuesday, Eliza. You've been doing it for 3 years. You don't bring anyone else food." "He doesn't eat right on his own. Half the men in this county don't eat right on their own. You're not cooking for them." Marta looked at her with the frankness of a woman who had no patience for indirection. "He's 30 years older than you. I'm aware of basic arithmetic. People are going to talk. People already talk. It doesn't seem to have slowed down." Marta was quiet for a moment, studying her with something that might have been either disapproval or respect. Then she said, "He's a good man, Nathan Cole. He always was." She paused. "Doesn't mean it's simple." "I know," Eliza said, and she meant it. She wasn't pretending it was simple. She was just not sure yet what she was going to do with the thing that wasn't simple. She walked home with her parcels and didn't think about it anymore that day, which was a lie. But it was the kind of lie you told yourself when you needed to get through a Tuesday without making any irreversible decisions. The Tuesday before Christmas, she cooked a roast she had been saving the meat for and brought it across in the dark and knocked, which she didn't always do. Nathan opened the door and she could see he had been sitting at his kitchen table with papers spread out, land records or financial documents, the kind of thing he worked through in the evenings. "Special occasion?" he said, seeing the roast. "No," she said. "I just had the meat." He let her in. She set it on the stove and he moved the papers off the table, and she noticed they were indeed land documents, and she noticed one of them had the boundary line between their properties marked on it, but she didn't say anything about that. They ate slowly. The wind was up outside, hitting the windows with the particular flatness of a December night in Colorado. It was warm in the kitchen, which was unusual. Nathan kept the fire banked lower than she would have, but tonight he had it going properly, and the warmth made everything feel slightly suspended, like being inside something that the weather hadn't gotten to yet. "Cody's leaving in the spring," Nathan said. She looked up. "Going where?" "His family in Kansas. His mother's sick." He pushed a piece of potato around his plate. "Can't ask him to stay." "No," she said. "You can't. Going to be harder to manage the operation without him." She considered this. "You could hire someone new." "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. He was looking at his plate with the expression he wore when he was thinking about something he wasn't saying, which she had learned to read but not to push. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "The land documents on the table," she said carefully. "The boundary survey." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the east section." He set his fork down, not dramatically, just putting it down. "About whether the line between our properties makes as much practical sense as it used to, given the water access on your side and the pasture on mine." She looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. "That's a practical conversation?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it only a practical conversation?" He breathed in once, slow, looking at her. Outside, the wind hit the window again. The lamp on the counter shifted slightly in a draft. "I don't know what I'm allowed to say," he said finally. "You can say whatever's true," she said. "I'm not fragile." He picked up his fork again, looked at it, put it down again. "You're 25 years old," he said. "You've got everything in front of you. Daniel Grant is a decent man with a decent future and the whole town behind him. I'm 55, and I've already had my life, and I'm asking myself what right I've got to even be thinking." He stopped. "To be thinking what?" He didn't answer that. He shook his head slightly, the way men do when they're refusing to complete a thought they've already admitted too much of. She didn't push it. She finished her plate. She helped him clear the table, wash the pot, put on her coat. At the door she stopped. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "The boundary line between our properties," she said. "I think you should think about that more carefully." She walked home in the cold, and she didn't look back, but she heard him standing on the porch for a long time before she heard the door close. The door closed, and the cold came back in around her like it had been waiting. Eliza walked the quarter-mile home with her hands in her coat pockets and the wind at her back, and she didn't sort through what had just happened because there was nothing to sort yet. Nathan hadn't said anything. Not really. He had stopped himself at exactly the moment when stopping yourself costs the most, and she wasn't sure if that was wisdom or cowardice, or just a man who had been alone long enough that he didn't trust what he was feeling anymore. She went to bed and slept badly, which was unusual for her. She was not a person who lost sleep over things she couldn't control. But this felt different from uncontrollable. It felt like something that was sitting right at the edge of controllable, like a fence post that was leaning but hadn't fallen yet, and she didn't know whether to push it or let it find its own way down. Christmas came and went quietly. She spent it with the Aldridge family down the road, who had 3 children and always made too much food and were generous about sharing both. Nathan, she knew, spent it alone. She had left a covered tin on his fence post the day before. Not the Tuesday ritual, just an extra. And it was gone by evening, and the tin was back the next morning washed and folded with a cloth on top, same as always. She stood looking at it in the cold morning light and felt something that had no name she wanted to give it. January was hard. January in Colorado is always hard. But this one came in with a particular brutality. Temperatures that dropped below what was reasonable, ice on the water sources that took an hour every morning to break through, winds that found every gap in every structure and settled in like they owned the place. Eliza lost 1 cow to the cold, an older one who had been struggling since fall, and she found her in the morning stiff in the east pasture and spent the better part of that day in a mood that had no room for conversation. She still brought food on Tuesdays. She didn't stop. It had become part of the week's structure, the way everything becomes when you do it long enough without questioning it, and she wasn't ready to question it. Or she was, but she wasn't ready to have the conversation that questioning it would require. Nathan was quieter in January than usual. He always went inward in winter. She had noticed that. He worked, he managed, he didn't socialize much beyond what was necessary. But there was a different quality to his quiet now, something she couldn't quite locate. He accepted the food, he talked about the cattle and the weather, and once about a section of his barn roof that was starting to buckle under the snow load. He looked at her the same way he always looked at her, which was directly and with attention, and she sometimes had the feeling that he was working something out behind those eyes that he had decided she wasn't going to be part of. It bothered her more than she wanted it to. Daniel Grant came to call in January twice, which was more than he had managed in December. He was not deterred by weather, which she had to give him credit for. He showed up the second time on a Thursday evening when the temperature was genuinely miserable, with a wrapped parcel that turned out to be a good wool blanket from the store's stock, and he stood at her door in the cold with his hat in his hand and said he had thought she could use it out here. She let him in because it was freezing and because refusing felt unnecessarily cruel to a man who had done nothing wrong. He sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee, and they talked for an hour. He was easy to talk to, she gave him that consistently. He was curious about her operation in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. He asked specific questions and listened to the answers and didn't try to tell her how to do things differently, which was an improvement over most men she talked to about ranching. He told her about Denver, about what it had been like to be in a city that size after growing up in Durango, the way it had felt enormous and impersonal and exciting all at once. "Did you want to stay?" she asked. "For a while," he said honestly. "And then I realized I was treating it like something to accomplish rather than somewhere to live. There's a difference." He looked at her. "You know that difference." "I do," she said. "This place is real to you," he said. "This land. I can see it when you talk about it. You're not here because you didn't have other options. You're here because this is actually what you want." "Yes," she said. "I respect that." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I want you to know that I know people in town have ideas about what makes sense, about the two of us. I'm not here because the town has ideas." He looked up. "I'm here because I'd like to know you better, that's all. However that turns out." She looked at him for a moment. He was a genuinely decent person. She had been looking for reasons to dismiss him because it would have been easier, and she kept failing to find them, which was its own kind of frustrating. "I appreciate that," she said, and meant it. He left before dark, and she stood at the window and watched him ride back toward town. And then she looked east across the fields, where Nathan's lamp was burning in the kitchen window, like it always was in the evening, a small yellow square of light 2 pastures away. She put her hand on the cold glass, and then took it off and went to do the evening chores. February brought a break in the weather that was brief and clearly not to be trusted, one of those weeks in late winter when the temperature comes up 10 degrees and the snow starts to pull back from the south-facing slopes, and everything in you wants to believe spring is possible, even though you know better. Eliza used it to get ahead on repairs she had been putting off. Patched 2 sections of fence, reset a gate post, got onto the barn roof to look at a spot she had been worried about. She was up on that roof when she heard Nathan's voice below her. "What are you doing up there?" She looked down. He was standing in the yard with his hands in his coat, looking up at her with the expression he wore when he thought she was doing something inadvisable, but wasn't going to say so directly. "Looking at this seam," she said. "It's been leaking when the snowmelt comes off. I can see it from here. You need flashing, not a patch." "I know I need flashing. I don't have flashing." "I do," he said. "I've got a roll left over from my barn. Come down from there before the temperature drops and that roof gets slick." She came down. Not because he told her to, because he was right about the temperature, which was already starting to shift back toward cold as the afternoon went on. She climbed down the side ladder, and he steadied it without being asked, one hand on the rail, not making anything of it. He went back to his place and came back 20 minutes later with the roll of flashing and his tools, and they worked on the roof together in the thinning afternoon light, not talking much because the work required attention. He was competent in that way she had noticed consistently, not showy about it, just capable and efficient and not wasting motion. When something wasn't working, he tried something different without making a production of the failure. They finished before dark, which was close. She climbed down first and he followed, and they stood in the yard in the failing light, both of them cold and slightly grimy with roof work. "Thank you," she said. You'd have gotten there, he said. You always do. There it was again, that particular thing he said that was both a compliment and a wall. She looked at him. Nathan, she said, why do you keep doing that? He looked back at her. Doing what? Saying things like that. You'd have gotten there, you always do. Like you're trying to convince yourself you're not necessary. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something move through his face that he didn't quite manage to keep still. I'm not necessary, he said. You've made that clear enough. You run that place perfectly well on your own. I run it, she said. That's different from perfectly well. She held his gaze. And you came over with the flashing. You needed flashing. I know what I needed, she said. I'm asking why you came. He looked at her for a long time, and she could see him making the calculation she had seen him make before, the one where he weighed something carefully and then put it back on the shelf. But this time something was different. This time he didn't look away first. Because I wanted to, he said finally. She nodded once. All right, she said. That's an honest answer. She took his tools back to the barn for him while he rolled up the remaining flashing. And when she came back, he was standing at the gate and the light was almost gone. He looked at her with the particular expression that was his version of being unsure what to say next. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday, she agreed. She watched him walk back across the field, and she stood there a moment longer than was practical in the cold, and then she went inside. The whispers in Durango started properly in February. Not about anything specific. There was nothing specific to talk about, because nothing specific had happened. But Eliza Harper was 25 and unmarried, and Daniel Grant was clearly interested and everybody knew it. And there was a mounting social pressure in the town that had the particular character of people deciding something on your behalf and expecting you to confirm it when asked. Mrs. Holt at the dry goods counter mentioned Daniel's prospects unprompted. Reverend Marsh's wife said something at the February social about young women knowing their own minds, which was aimed at Eliza with the precision of a woman who considers herself helpful. Even Tom Aldridge, who was generally sensible, said something to her about how Daniel was a good man and stability mattered in this country. She knew they weren't wrong about Daniel. That was the part that was complicated. They weren't wrong about stability either. They were just making a decision about what counted as stable based on information she didn't share. The February social was where Daniel finally asked her properly. Not for her hand, nothing that formal. But he found her near the end of the evening, and they walked to the edge of the hall, and he said, quietly, and without performance, I'd like to court you properly, Eliza. Not just showing up and hoping. I'd like to know if there's actually a chance there, or if I should stop. She looked at him and thought about how much she respected that, how clean and honest it was, how few men would have said it that plainly. Daniel, she said, I want to be honest with you. Please, he said, I think you're a good man, genuinely, and I think we could talk about almost anything and I wouldn't be bored. That's not a small thing. She paused. But I don't think my heart is free to give you what you're asking for, and I think you deserve someone who can. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him absorb it with more grace than she had expected. His jaw tightened briefly, the only sign that it cost him something. Is it coal? He said. She hesitated half a second too long. It's all right, he said. You don't have to answer that. He looked at her steadily. He's a good man, too. Different, but good. Nothing has. I know, Daniel said. I've got eyes. He almost smiled, a little tiredly. The man watches you like he's trying to memorize you and is furious at himself for doing it. She didn't say anything to that. Well, Daniel said. He picked up his hat from the table beside them. I hope it works out. For both of you. I mean that. She believed him. She shook his hand and he nodded and walked back into the gathering and was gracious and cheerful with everyone around him because that was who he was. And she watched him and felt a complicated mixture of relief and guilt, and something that was almost grief for the simpler version of her life that she was apparently not going to choose. The news got around the way it does. She hadn't said anything, but she hadn't needed to. The fact that Daniel stopped showing up at her property spoke clearly enough. The town's reaction was mixed in the way Durango's reactions always were. Some people were openly puzzled, some were quietly disapproving, And Marta Blevins came into the post office the morning after the social and said simply, "So, you made a choice." "I made a choice," Eliza confirmed. "Does Cole know he's the choice?" "That," she said, "is a separate question." She picked up her mail and left. The separate question was the one that occupied the rest of February and all of March, in a way she could not quite get out from under. Because the truth, the honest truth, was that Nathan had not made any kind of declaration. He had said one sentence, "because I wanted to," on a cold afternoon in her yard, and that was the entirety of what she had to work with. He came every time she needed the kind of help she actually needed. He accepted every Tuesday without fail. He looked at her with an attention that she felt across a room, but he had also called himself not necessary, had said her name with that careful restraint, had stopped himself every single time he got close to saying the things she needed him to say. She was not a woman who waited well. She had never been that woman. But she also understood, in the way you understand something about a person when you've watched them closely enough, that pushing Nathan Cole produced nothing. That he would get there or he wouldn't, and the only thing she could do was be honest about where she was standing. The question was how long she was prepared to stand there. March brought mud and longer light and the first real signs that the land was going to open up again. And with it came a particular restlessness that had nowhere to go. She worked the ranch with the same discipline she always did, got her spring planting preparation done, checked on the cattle, repaired what winter had broken. She was good at her work and she knew it, and there was always some satisfaction in that, but it existed separately from the other thing. The thing she kept carrying across 2 pastures every Tuesday and setting down on someone else's table. Nathan came over on a Thursday in March without being asked, which was new. He showed up at her barn while she was working on her tack, just walked in and looked at what she was doing and asked if she wanted help with the spring pasture rotation because his east section shared her water access and it would make sense to coordinate. "It would," she said carefully. "I thought we could walk it," he said. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." They walked it the next morning, the two of them moving through the property together in the thin spring light, and she noticed that he stayed close to her in a way that was slightly different from functional. Not touching, but present, the way a person is present when they have decided, somewhere below the level of decision, that they want to be near you. He pointed out a low section along the creek that was going to flood in April and suggested a drainage solution that was actually better than the one she had been considering. She told him so. He looked pleased in the brief, almost concealed way he had. They stood at the south fence line where the properties met, looking across both ranches in the morning quiet, and she thought about the boundary survey she had seen on his table in December and wondered if he was thinking about it too. "Cody leaves at the end of the month," Nathan said. "I know. Going to need to restructure some things." She looked at him. He was looking out at the pasture. "What kind of things?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the east section again," he said. "About efficiency. About what makes sense going forward." "Nathan," he stopped. "What are you actually saying?" she said. "Not the practical version. The real one." He turned and looked at her with the expression she had never quite seen him wear before. The one where he had run out of ways to protect himself and was just standing there without the protection. He looked older in that moment, and also somehow less defended than she had ever seen him, and she thought that this was probably the closest to honest he had been since she'd known him, and it scared him, and he was doing it anyway. "I don't know how to say it without sounding like a fool," he said. "Then sound like a fool," she said. "I've done it plenty." He looked at her for a long moment in the spring morning, the mud drying around their boots, the mountains in the distance doing what mountains do, which is nothing, which is just being there, solid and enormous and patient. "I think about you," he said, "all the time, more than makes sense." He stopped. "I know what the arithmetic looks like. I know what people would say. I know that you've got your whole life." "Stop," she said. He stopped. "Don't tell me about the arithmetic," she said. "I can do the arithmetic myself. I've been doing it for 3 years. She held his gaze. "I didn't ask you about the numbers. I asked what you were actually saying." He breathed out slowly. The wind came across the pasture and moved the dry grass at the fence line. "I don't want to be your neighbor anymore," he said. "I want to be something else. I don't know what I'm allowed to want, but that's what it is." She stood there for a moment looking at him, this man with rust-stained hands and a worn-down kitchen, and a habit of stopping himself at exactly the wrong moment. This man who had shown up with flashing when her roof was leaking, and pine tar when her trough wouldn't seal, and 3 years of washed pots on a fence post. "You're allowed," she said quietly. He looked at her like he hadn't heard her right, like he was waiting for the other part, the part where it turned complicated. "Nathan," she said, "you are allowed." He didn't say anything, neither did she. They stood at the fence line between their properties in the March light, and nothing was resolved yet, nothing was decided, but something had finally been said out loud, and the saying of it changed the shape of the air between them in a way that couldn't be taken back. Which meant, she thought, that something was going to happen next. The thing about saying something out loud is that you can't unsay it, and for a few days after that morning at the fence line, the weight of what had passed between them settled into the space around them like new weather. Not a storm exactly, but a change in pressure that both of them could feel, and neither of them quite knew how to move through. Nathan went home that afternoon and did not come back for 5 days. Not in an angry way, not in a retreating way. He was still visible across the fields, working his property the same as always, and the pot was still on the fence post Wednesday morning, washed and folded. But he didn't come to her door, and he didn't appear at the barn, and she understood, without needing it explained, that he was doing what he did when something required processing, which was to go quiet and work and let it settle into him at whatever pace it needed to. She let him. It cost her something, but she let him. She had her own thinking to do. She stood at the kitchen window in the evenings that week and looked out at his lamp burning across the pasture and asked herself the question she had been circling around for months. Not whether she wanted this, because she had stopped pretending she didn't know the answer to that, but whether she was ready for what wanting it actually meant. It meant a town that was already confused about her would have something new to be confused about. It meant taking a risk on a man who was still learning to take the same risk himself. It meant that the quiet, functional rhythm she had built her life around was going to change, and she had worked hard for that rhythm, and change was not free. She knew all of that. She had sat with it through the winter, and it hadn't moved her, which told her what she needed to know. On the 6th day, Nathan came back. It was a Saturday, not a Tuesday, and he walked across the field in the morning and knocked on her door properly, which he almost never did. When she opened it, he had his hat in his hand and the look of a man who had prepared something to say and was now uncertain whether it was the right thing. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "Come in." He came in and stood in her kitchen and did not sit down, which meant he needed to say whatever he had come to say while he still had the nerve for it. She stood across the kitchen and waited and did not make it easier for him, because she had decided that making it easier was not what either of them needed right now. "I meant what I said," he started, "about wanting to be something else to you. I meant it." He turned his hat in his hands once. "But I've been sitting with it all week, and I keep coming up against the same wall." "What wall?" "That I'm 55 years old, Eliza. That's not a small thing. I've already had my life in a lot of the ways that matter. Margaret and I had 20 years, and that was real, and it's gone. And I've made my peace with it as much as a person can. But you haven't had any of that yet. You haven't had the time to know what you actually want." She looked at him steadily. "I'm 25, not 15. I've been running this property alone for 4 years. I think I know my own mind." "I know you do," he said. "I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying—" He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back at her. "I'm saying I've got less time than you. That's arithmetic, not opinion. And I don't want you to get 10 years down the road and realize you made a choice that cost you something you can't get back." She was quiet for a moment. The thing was, she had thought about this too. She had thought about it carefully and honestly, and without trying to make it feel better than it was. And she had come to something that she now said out loud. "Nathan," she said, "every choice costs something. That's not specific to you." She leaned against the counter. "If I chose Daniel Grant, that cost me something too. It cost me this." She gestured between them, at the kitchen, at the space they had built over 3 years of Tuesday evenings, and fence repairs and washed pots and honest conversation. "You're asking me to protect myself from a risk that might not happen by definitely giving up something that I already know is real." He didn't answer right away. "I'm not saying I don't see the risk," she said. "I do. I've done the arithmetic you're so worried about, but I'd rather have the real thing for whatever time there is than spend 30 years with someone safe, wondering what would have happened if I'd had the courage to say yes when I knew the answer." He He stood there with his hat in his hand and the morning light coming in the window at a low angle, and she watched him working through it. The visible calculation of a man who had talked himself out of things for 3 years and was now being told, not asked, told, that the calculation had been wrong. "You're sure," he said. "I've been sure," she said. "You're the one who needed convincing." Something shifted in his face then, very slightly, the way something shifts in a structure when the load it's been carrying is redistributed. Not dramatic, just a change in how the weight sits. He nodded once. "All right," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss or a speech, or any of the things that stories suggested this moment should contain. It was two people standing in a kitchen on a Saturday morning in March, with mud on their boots and too much work waiting outside, deciding something quietly. But it was real, which was the only thing she had ever cared about it being. "Stay for coffee," she said. "I've got work," he said. 15 minutes. He pulled out a chair and sat down. The April Harvest Social was the event Durango used to mark the end of the hard season. A gathering held at the Aldridge Barn every year with food and music and the kind of communal relief that came from surviving another Colorado winter. Everyone went. It was not optional in any practical sense, and Eliza had been attending it since she was old enough to remember, first with her father and then, for the past 4 years, alone. This year she arrived with no particular plan except to get through it. She knew that she and Nathan had not made anything public. They were still feeling their way along the edge of something new, still finding out what it was in the daylight before they explained it to anyone else. He had been coming for coffee on Saturday mornings now, and once he had stayed long enough that they had talked through noon, and something was clearly happening, but it was happening at Nathan's pace, which was slower than hers, and she was doing her best to respect that. She found Ruth Aldridge at the food table immediately and helped her reorganize the serving order because Ruth was managing it badly, and Eliza couldn't watch that without intervening. They worked side by side for 20 minutes, and Ruth told her about her youngest daughter's new tooth and her husband's back trouble. And Eliza listened and contributed where she could, and it was the kind of conversation that was entirely unremarkable, and she was grateful for it. Nathan came in about an hour after she did. He came in the way he always did, without ceremony, nodded at a few people, got himself a drink, and stood near the wall in that particular way of his that communicated he was present and aware without being especially interested in performing sociability. Cody was with him, which surprised her. She had thought Cody was already gone to Kansas. Maybe the departure had been delayed. The boy looked uncomfortable in the gathered space and stayed close to Nathan's elbow like a younger brother. And Nathan seemed to notice this and kept him in conversation, which was the kind of thing Nathan did that most people never saw. She was talking to Ben Marsh about spring cattle prices when she became aware of Agnes Porter standing nearby. And Agnes Porter was not someone you could be unaware of, because Agnes had opinions the size of a barn and the volume to match. She was 50-something and had lived in Durango all her life, and had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children, and considered herself the practical conscience of the town, which the town largely accepted because it was easier than arguing. Agnes was talking to Harriet Cole, who was Nathan's cousin and had come in from her place south of town. Eliza wasn't trying to listen, but the hall was crowded and the voices carried. "The Harper girls made her choice then," Agnes said, not quietly. "Turned down the Grant boy. Don't know what she's waiting for at this point." "Maybe she knows what she wants," Harriet said mildly. "What she wants and what makes sense aren't always the same thing, and that's all I'll say about it." She said more about it. Eliza moved away before she could hear the rest, but she had heard enough to know the town's patience with her ambiguity was running out. Durango wanted a resolution. It had decided what the resolution should be, and now it was waiting for her to cooperate. She found herself near the back corner of the barn with a plate she wasn't eating from, and she was standing there when Daniel Grant appeared beside her, which she hadn't expected. He had a drink in one hand and looked genuinely relaxed, not performing anything. "Don't worry," he said immediately. "I'm not here to make things complicated." She almost laughed. "You're the least complicated part of this evening." "That's a first," he said. He glanced around the room. "Agnes Porter is talking about you." "Agnes Porter talks about everyone." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, and I know it's worth exactly nothing at this point, I think you should just say what's true. Whatever it is." He looked at her. "This town will adjust. It always does. It just needs someone to make a clear move first. That's easy to say. I know, he said. I'm also the guy who asked you directly and got a direct answer, so I'm some evidence that direct is not as catastrophic as it feels. She looked at him with something that might have been genuine affection. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me. Just stop letting Agnes Porter set the terms. He raised his glass slightly and moved off into the crowd, easy and unbothered, and she watched him go and thought that Durango didn't deserve him going unappreciated for long. She found Nathan near the side door about 30 minutes later. He had shed Cody somewhere and was standing alone with his drink, watching the fiddle player set up in the corner. When she came to stand next to him, he glanced over but didn't move away, which in Nathan's language was the equivalent of an open invitation. Agnes Porter's been talking, she said. Agnes Porter's always talking, he said. What about this time? About me, about the Grant situation, about what she considers my apparent lack of direction. He was quiet, looking at the fiddle player. Nathan, she said. Yeah. I don't want to hide this. She said it evenly, not as a demand, just as a fact that needed to be on the table. I understand we're early. I understand you need to get comfortable with it, but I'm not interested in pretending to the whole town that I haven't made up my mind. He turned and looked at her. In the lamplight of the barn, his face showed all its years, and she did not mind a single one of them. You haven't made anything up for both of us, he said carefully. I know that. I'm talking about my own side of it. She held his gaze. But I think you should know that I'm going to be honest about where I stand when people ask me directly. You can decide what that means for you. He thought about that for a moment, and she watched him do it, the visible working of a man who did not make fast decisions about anything that mattered, which was generally a quality she respected, but which was currently testing her. The whole town's going to have something to say, he said. Yes. It won't be kind. No, she said. It won't. He looked at her steadily. And you don't care. I care, she said. I just care about the wrong things more. The fiddle started up in the corner, and some of the younger couples moved toward the middle of the floor, and the barn filled with sound and movement, and Eliza and Nathan stood at the edge of it together, and neither of them moved away. Agnes Porter found her 20 minutes later. She materialized out of the crowd with the certainty of a woman who had decided she was doing someone a favor, and she positioned herself in front of Eliza with Harriet Cole in tow. And she said, without any particular preamble, I want to ask you something, and I expect a straight answer. That depends on the question, Eliza said. Is it Nathan Cole? Agnes said it flat, like a statement shaped into a question. Are you setting your sights on Nathan Cole? The barn was loud enough that not everyone near them could hear, but some could, and Eliza was aware of the radius of attention, of eyes that had gone sideways toward them without bodies turning, of the particular stillness that comes over a crowd when something real is about to happen. She had not planned this. She had not planned to say it here, in public, in the middle of the Aldridge barn at the Harvest Social, with half the town within earshot. But Agnes Porter had asked a straight question, and she had said she expected a straight answer, and Eliza Harper had never been a woman who went sideways on a thing when going straight was available. Yes, she said. The word went out into the air and did not come back. Agnes blinked. He's 30 years older than you. I know how old he is. He was married. I know that too. Eliza, Agnes said, and now her voice had shifted slightly, still authoritative, but with something underneath it that was almost concerned, almost genuine. You're a young woman with good prospects. You have a good property and a good name. Daniel Grant is right there, and he's been patient, and I appreciate that you mean well, Eliza said. I do. But what you're describing is not a life. It's an arrangement. She kept her voice even. She was not angry. She was clear, which was different. I've spent 4 years building something real on that ranch. I'm not going to build my life on something that isn't real, too, just because the math looks cleaner on paper. Agnes opened her mouth and closed it. Harriet Cole, who had said almost nothing the whole time, looked at her cousin-in-law's name hanging in the air and said quietly, Nathan, know you feel this way? He's working on it, Eliza said. Harriet almost smiled. She walked away from Agnes Porter and moved through the barn and didn't look for Nathan right away because she needed a moment, and she thought he probably did too. What she had said had moved through the space already. She could feel it, the way information moves in a small gathering, the low current of it passing from person to person. It was done. Whatever came next was going to come from a place of honesty, which was the only place she had ever been interested in operating from. She found him 10 minutes later near the door. He was standing with Ben Marsh and one of the Aldridge sons, and when she came over, Ben and the young man both found reasons to be somewhere else, which told her the news had reached him. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not angry, not embarrassed, or not only embarrassed. Something more complicated than that. "I heard," he said. "I figured." "You told Agnes Porter." "She asked," Eliza said. "You know I don't go sideways on things." He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, and the barn noise went on around them, the fiddle and the voices and the sound of a community continuing to be itself regardless of what was happening in its margins. "You said I was working on it," he said. "You are. That makes me sound—" He stopped, not quite able to finish the sentence. "It makes you sound like a man who's careful about things that matter," she said, "which is exactly what you are." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away this time. Something was different in his face, not resolved, not easy, but open in a way it hadn't been. Like the last of the protection had decided it wasn't worth the cost. "I don't want you going out there and saying things like that while I'm still—" He pressed his lips together. "While I'm still standing on the wrong side of the fence." "Then come to the right side," she said simply. He stood there in the barn doorway with the cold April night behind him, and the warm, lamp-lit crowd in front of him, and Eliza Harper in front of him. And she watched him make a decision the way she had watched him make every decision she had ever seen him make. Not fast, not dramatic, but in a way that meant it was going to hold. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not here." "All right. Tomorrow morning." "I'll be at the barn," she said. He nodded and put his hat on and walked out into the April night, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, the cold air coming in around her, and she felt the particular sensation of a thing approaching. Not a resolution yet, but the threshold of one, and she had been standing at it long enough that she was not afraid of what was on the other side. She turned back into the warmth of the barn and found Ruth Aldridge and helped with the dishes because the evening wasn't over yet, and she was still a person who showed up for the work that needed doing, even on the nights when everything was about to change. She slept that night the way you sleep when something has been decided but not yet delivered. Not badly, but lightly. Her mind not quite willing to let go of the day. She was up before the sun without needing to try, dressed in the dark, and had the stove going and the coffee made before the first color came into the sky. She went to the barn and started the morning work because the animals didn't know anything had happened and didn't care. And that was actually a relief. She moved through the routine with the automatic competence of years. Feed, water, check the young heifer who had been off her feed for 2 days, muck out the stall that needed it. The physical work settled something in her chest that the night had stirred loose, and by the time the sun was fully up, she was calmer than she had expected to be. She heard him coming before she saw him. Not his footsteps. The particular way the gate at the property line swung and latched, a sound she had learned without meaning to. She kept working, and he came into the barn and stood in the doorway the way he always did, taking in what was in front of him before he moved further into it. "Coffee's on the stove," she said, without looking up from the heifer. "I'm all right," he said. He came further in and leaned against the stall across from her, watching her work. She could feel him working up to it, and she gave him the space to do that, keeping her hands busy, not filling the silence with anything that would make it easier for him to stay quiet. "I've been up most of the night," he said finally. "I figured." "Thinking about what you said at the social." She waited. "About going sideways on things." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands where they rested on the stall rail. "I've been going sideways on this for 3 years, Eliza. I need you to understand that I know that. I'm not blind to it." "I know you're not," she said. "I kept telling myself it was the right thing. Keeping the distance." He exhaled slowly. "That you were young and you'd figure out what you wanted and what you wanted wouldn't be this. Me." He gestured at himself with a kind of unflinching self-awareness that was hard to look at. An old widower with a bad knee and a property that needs work and not enough years in front of him. She put down the brush she was holding and turned and looked at him directly. "Are you finished?" He blinked. "Because I've heard that speech," she said, "or versions of it, and I've been patient with it because I understand where it comes from. But I'm going to say something now, and I need you to actually hear it." He straightened slightly. "I don't need you to have a lot of years," she said. "I need you to be honest with me. I need someone who shows up when the fence goes down at midnight and doesn't make a thing of it. I need someone who knows what 3-foot post depth and a rock layer at the bottom means, and why it matters, and isn't going to look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language when I talk about it." She held his gaze. "I've had one of everything else on offer in this county, and none of it was what I was looking for. You have been what I was looking for every Tuesday for 3 years, and I am done pretending I don't know that." He was very still. "So," she said, "whatever you came here to say this morning, say it. Not the version where you're protecting me from a choice I've already made. The real one." He looked at her for a long moment in the barn light, the animals moving quietly around them, the morning coming in through the gaps in the boards, and she watched him cross some internal line that she had been waiting years for him to cross. He pushed off the rail and walked the 3 steps between them, and stopped close enough that she could see the line of his jaw working once, the way it did when he was forcing something out that didn't come naturally. "I don't want to be your neighbor anymore," he said. It was the same thing he had said at the fence line, but it landed differently here, without any of the hedging around it. "I want to come in the front door. I want to sit at your table and know it's where I'm supposed to be." He stopped, and she could see the cost of it, the visible effort of a man saying something he had been carrying alone for a very long time. "I want to ask you, not assume, not push. I want to ask you if I can come into your life properly, if that's something you'd have." She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "I've been waiting for you to ask that," she said, "for longer than you know." He breathed out like something had broken loose inside him, and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face the way you touch something you've been careful around for too long, and he covered her hand with his, rough and warm, and for a moment they just stood there in the barn with the horses and the morning and 3 years of Tuesdays behind them, and something entirely new in front of them that neither of them had a map for yet. It was not a perfect moment. His knee was bothering him, and he was tired from a sleepless night, and there was manure on her boot, and the heifer was making an annoyed sound in the stall behind her. It was just real, which was everything. The town found out formally within the week, which was about 4 days longer than it took for the information to be everywhere anyway. Eliza did not announce it, and Nathan did not announce it. They simply stopped concealing it, which in a town the size of Durango was the same as an announcement run in the paper. The reactions came in several distinct varieties. There were the people who were quietly supportive, mostly the ones who had known both of them long enough to understand the shape of what had been building. Ruth Aldridge said only "good" when Eliza told her, in the flat, decisive tone of a woman who had seen it coming and was relieved to be done waiting. Harriet Cole, Nathan's cousin, rode over on a Wednesday and spent an hour in Eliza's kitchen and said several things about Nathan that were affectionate and exasperated in equal measure, and left with what looked like approval. Then there were the others. Agnes Porter did not soften her position. She made her views known through a combination of direct statement and the particular social architecture that women like her had perfected over decades, who she sat next to at the Sunday gathering, which conversations she steered toward certain topics, which questions she asked just loudly enough that they carried. The message was consistent. This was irregular, and irregular made things harder for everyone, and Eliza Harper was a young woman who was going to look back on this decision and understand eventually that the town had tried to tell her something. Tom Holt, who ran the livery, said something to Nathan directly and bluntly about what he called the inappropriateness of the situation, using the word inappropriate twice, which Nathan received without expression and responded to with a single sentence about minding his own operation, and walked away. He told Eliza about it that evening at her kitchen table, and she could see the tightness around his jaw that meant it had bothered him more than he was letting on. "Does it change anything?" she asked. He looked at her. "No." "Then it's just noise," she said. "I know it is," he said. "Doesn't mean I enjoy it." "No," she agreed. "Neither do I." They sat with that for a moment, both of them honest about the fact that other people's opinions were not nothing, even when you had decided they weren't going to move you. They weren't moving either of them, but they were present, and pretending they weren't would have been its own kind of dishonesty. What surprised her was Daniel Grant. He came to her property on a Thursday in late April, which was unexpected, and he stood at the door with the particular air of a man who had decided to do something he wasn't sure would be well received, but had decided to do it anyway. "I'm not here to complicate anything," he said immediately, which was the second time he had led with that sentence, and it made her trust him slightly more each time. "Come in," she said. He sat at her table and she made coffee, and he turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to say it directly," he said. "I don't have any hard feelings. I want you to know that." He looked up. "I spent some time being disappointed, which is only honest, but I've had enough time to think clearly about it, and what I keep coming back to is that you told me the truth when you could have been vague about it, and I respect that more than I can probably say." She looked at him. "You didn't deserve vague." "No," he said, "but a lot of people would have given it to me anyway." He paused. "Cole's a good man. I said that before and I mean it." "He is," she said. Daniel nodded once, and that seemed to settle something for him. He finished his coffee and stood up and picked up his hat, and at the door he turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "the people in this town who think you've made some kind of mistake, they're measuring your life against something they decided it should look like. That's their limitation, not yours." He left, and she stood at the window and watched him ride back toward Durango, and she thought that the town had genuinely underestimated him, and she hoped he found something that matched what he had to offer. May came and the land opened up in the full demanding way of Colorado spring, everything that had been dormant since October suddenly requiring attention simultaneously. The ground thawing and the grass coming and the cattle needing to be moved and the fencing needing to be checked and 100 smaller things that added up to weeks of hard consecutive work. Eliza moved through it with the same discipline she always brought to the season. But something was different now, and the difference was that Nathan was there. Not in an intrusive way. He didn't take over her operation or make decisions that weren't his to make, but he was present in the practical ways that mattered, showing up to help move the cattle to the spring pasture, which went faster with 2 people than she had ever managed it alone. Coming over to look at a section of fence she was concerned about, bringing his own tools and working alongside her without ceremony. On the days they were working his property, he would sometimes call across for her opinion on something, which he would not have done a year ago. And she would come over and look and tell him what she thought, and he would listen in the way he listened, fully, without the defensive half-attention of someone waiting to reassert their own position. It was, she thought, almost exactly what she had always wanted and had not let herself fully imagine wanting. It was also hard in ways she hadn't expected. Nathan had habits from living alone for 3 years that were deeply settled. He went to bed earlier than she did and was up later, which meant their rhythms didn't naturally align. He was more private about certain things than she had understood when she was just his neighbor. And there were moments when he went somewhere quiet inside himself and she didn't know whether to follow or leave him there. And she got it wrong sometimes, and they had to talk about it, which he found difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. She found she had her own habits that were harder to move than she'd expected. She had built her life around self-sufficiency as a point of pride, and accepting help, even from Nathan, even when she wanted it, sometimes triggered something stubborn in her that she had to consciously override. He noticed it. He didn't always say something about it directly, but he noticed, and sometimes when she had been managing something on her own in a way that was technically fine, but would have been easier with 2, she would look up and find him watching her with a very particular expression that was not quite amusement and not quite frustration, but somewhere adjacent to both. "You could have asked," he said one evening, after she had spent 2 hours wrestling a piece of equipment back into position that the 2 of them could have handled in 40 minutes. "I handled it," she said. "I know you handled it." "Then why are you looking at me like that?" "Because," he said, "you are the most capable person I have ever watched deliberately not ask for help when she needs it. And I am trying to decide if that's admirable or infuriating." She looked at him. "Both," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Both." She went to wash her hands and came back and sat across from him at the table and said, "I don't know how to need people. I've been doing this alone for 4 years, and before that I was watching my father do it alone, and I think I just—" She stopped. "I learned that asking is the same as admitting something's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing's wrong with asking," he said. "I've asked you for things." "The pine tar," she said. The pine tar, he confirmed, and the fence post depth and the spring pasture rotation and your opinion on the drainage issue by the creek. He looked at her steadily. And none of those times did it make me less. It just made the thing easier. She sat with that. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it was true. I'll work on it, she said. I know you will, he said. And the way he said it was not impatient. It was the voice of a man who had decided to be in something and meant it, which was different from a voice that was managing expectations or running out of tolerance. It was just steady, which was, she had come to understand, the thing about Nathan Cole that mattered more than any other single quality he had. The Sunday social in late May was the one where everything sharpened again. She and Nathan arrived separately out of habit and found each other near the food table, and being near each other in public was still something they were both learning to do without the particular self-consciousness of a situation that had become normal between them but was still new to everyone else. She handed him a plate without asking, and he took it without making a thing of it, and she saw Ruth Aldridge clock this across the room with an expression of satisfaction. Agnes Porter, however, had not moved from her position. She found Eliza near the side wall during a lull in the evening and said, without any warm-up, I want you to know that I don't think you've thought this through. Eliza looked at her. Agnes, she said, I've thought about it longer than you have. You're 25 years old. Yes, she said patiently. I am still 25 years old. That hasn't changed since you pointed it out in February. He's going to leave you, Agnes said, and her voice had shifted. Not cruel, but urgent, the voice of someone who believed what they were saying. Not by choice, by time. And you're going to be 40 years old with a ranch and no partner and the best years behind you, and you'll understand then what you threw away. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about this, not dismissively, but actually. She thought about 40, about what the land would look like by then, about what the shape of her life would be. She thought about Nathan's knee and the gray at his temples and the arithmetic Agnes was so certain about. Maybe, she said, that could happen. She looked at Agnes. But I could also choose Daniel Grant and spend the next 20 years comfortable and correct and wondering every single day what was true and whether I had the nerve to go after it. She kept her voice even. Agnes, I know what you're trying to protect me from. I know it comes from somewhere real, but you're asking me to trade something certain for something safe, and that's a trade I've looked at from every angle, and I won't make it. Agnes stared at her. I'm not going to stop being your neighbor, Eliza said, and I'm not going to carry this as though it's something I need to be ashamed of. So you can keep disapproving, and I'll keep being respectful about the fact that you do, but it's not going to change my mind. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through her face that might have been something other than judgment, a flicker of something older and more complicated, the look of a woman who had made certain choices and was perhaps not entirely certain she had always chosen the thing that was true. You're stubborn, Agnes said finally. Yes, Eliza agreed. I am. Agnes made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite anything else, and moved away, and Eliza stood there and let out a slow breath and turned and found Nathan standing about 10 feet away, close enough to have heard most of it. He walked over to her. He did not say anything right away. He stood next to her and looked at the room, and she stood next to him and looked at the room, and after a moment he said quietly, without turning, You didn't have to do that. I know, she said. You've been doing it since the last social, standing in front of things so I don't have to. You've done it too, she said. Tom Holt. That's different. How? He was quiet. I don't know, he admitted. It just feels different when it's you doing it for me. She looked at him. Nathan, we're in this the same amount. That means the same direction. He thought about that. She watched him think about it. All right, he said. All right, she said. He picked up her empty cup and went and refilled it without being asked and brought it back. And she accepted it. And they stood there together at the edge of the evening while Durango continued its complicated relationship with their choices. And neither of them moved away from it, and neither of them moved away from each other. And that was, she thought, what it was going to look like from here. Not a town that had decided to bless them, but two people who had decided not to require that blessing to proceed. The June evening he came to her door with a folded piece of paper was the one she had been expecting without knowing she was expecting it. He knocked, which he still did, though the formality of it had become something more like a habit than a barrier. She opened the door and he stood there in the long summer light with his hat in one hand and the paper in the other. "What's that?" she said. "Survey map," he said. "Updated." She looked at him. "I had Ben Aldridge's boy redo it," he said. "The boundary line." He held it out. "I want to show you something." She took the map and unfolded it on the kitchen table, and he came in and stood beside her and pointed to the boundary between their two properties, the line she had seen on his table the previous December and had not mentioned. "If we moved this section here," he said, pointing to the east pasture, "it would give you better access to the water creek in dry season. And if this corner here came over to my side, I've got better grade for drainage. It doesn't change total acreage much for either of us, but it changes what's practical by a lot." She looked at the map. She could see exactly what he was describing. She had thought about the water access issue for 2 years and hadn't had a solution that didn't cost her something elsewhere. "This would work," she said slowly. "I know it would," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the map, not at her, but she could see the particular stillness of a man who was saying several things at once and only voicing the most practical of them. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "Is this about drainage and water access?" He held her gaze. "It's about making the land work the way it should," he said carefully, "for both of us. Together." She folded the map along its original creases and set it on the table between them. "Then let's do it right," she said. "All of it." He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and something settled between them in the kitchen on that June evening that was quieter and more permanent than anything that had been said at the social or the fence line or in the barn on the April morning. A decision made not with ceremony, but with a survey map on a kitchen table, and the particular seriousness of two people who understood that the thing they were building was going to require all of them, every day, without exception. "I'd like to do it right," he said. Outside, the Colorado summer was in full force, the mountains going gold at the top in the evening light, the fields between their properties green and working and full of everything that was still to come. They redrew the boundary line in July, on a morning when the heat came early and the air smelled like dry grass and something about to happen. Ben Aldridge's boy came out with his equipment and took the measurements and filed the paperwork with the county. And when it was done, Eliza and Nathan stood at the new line and looked at what they had made of the land between them. And it was not dramatic, and it was not ceremonial, and it was exactly right. The practical work of combining two operations that had been run separately for years turned out to be more complicated than either of them had anticipated, which should not have surprised them but did anyway. They had different systems for nearly everything, different ways of tracking which cattle had been treated for what, different approaches to rotating the pastures, different opinions about when a fence section was bad enough to replace versus worth patching for another season. These differences produced arguments, some of which were short and some of which were not. The first real one happened in August, over the north pasture rotation schedule. Nathan wanted to hold the cattle there 2 weeks longer than Eliza's plan called for, and he had reasons for it that were not unreasonable, and she had reasons for her timeline that were also not unreasonable. And they stood in the north pasture in the August heat and went back and forth about it with the particular friction of two people who were both competent and both accustomed to being the one who made the final call. "You're not wrong," she finally said with some effort, "but neither am I. And it's my pasture." He looked at her. "It's our pasture now." She opened her mouth and closed it. "The boundary moved," he said. Not pointedly, just as a fact that needed acknowledging. "We decided that together, which means the north section is both of ours, and we need to figure out how to make a call when we disagree." She stood there in the heat and felt the adjustment happening in real time, the recalibration of something she had been running alone for 4 years. It was not comfortable. It was also correct. "All right," she said, "then we need a system." "Yes," he said, "we do." They worked one out over the following week. Not elegantly, not without backtracking, but they worked one out. It was the first of many such systems, frameworks they built piece by piece for the practical business of running a shared operation between two people who had both developed strong habits in the absence of anyone to negotiate with. Some of the frameworks held, some of them they rebuilt twice. The point was they kept building them, which is the thing most people don't understand about partnership. that it is not a state you arrive at, but a practice you maintain, daily, imperfectly, without the option of stopping. Nathan moved into her house in September. It was his suggestion, offered without ceremony over coffee one morning, on the grounds that her house was structurally sounder and better positioned relative to the combined property's center, which was true and also not entirely the reason. She knew that, and he knew that, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of honesty. He brought very little with him: clothes, his tools, the ledger books he kept his records in, and a photograph of Margaret that he set on the shelf in the bedroom without asking if that was all right. She saw it there and did not say anything about it. She understood what it was. Not a complication, not a competition, just the evidence of a real life that had come before this one and deserved to remain visible. Margaret had been part of what made Nathan who he was, and who he was the reason Eliza was here. She was not interested in asking him to make himself smaller to fit the shape of a love story that had no room for history. She told him that once, not directly about the photograph, but in the context of a conversation about something else, and he went very still for a moment and then said, "Most people don't understand that." "I'm not most people," she said. "No," he said, "you're really not." The town did not transform its opinion overnight, or over a season, or even over the first year. What it did was the thing that towns always do eventually, which is get tired of the drama of disapproval and quietly begin to treat the new reality as though it had always been there. Agnes Porter was the last holdout, in the way that Agnes Porter was always the last holdout about everything. But even she began to acknowledge Eliza in the dry goods store without the particular weight of judgment in her voice, which was progress, and Eliza accepted it without comment. Harriet Cole came for a full weekend in the fall and declared the house improvements Nathan had made. Repainting the window frames, fixing the porch steps, rebuilding the soft spot in the middle board, to be long overdue. And told Eliza privately that she had never seen her cousin look less like a man who had decided he was finished with things. He was disappearing when Margaret died, Harriet said. Not all at once, just a little more every year. I kept watching it happen, and I didn't know how to stop it. Eliza thought about that, about the worn-down house and the banked low fire and the single bowl on the shelf, about the way he had moved when she first started coming across with food, careful, contained, like a man making himself take up less room. He wasn't disappearing, she said. He was waiting. He just didn't know for what. Harriet looked at her for a moment. You might be right, she said. He might not have known, but you did. She hadn't, actually, not consciously. She had just kept showing up on Tuesdays because it was the true thing to do, and the true thing had its own momentum, and she had followed it all the way here. The second year was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because the novelty of having made a brave choice wears off, and what remains is just the ordinary difficulty of sharing a life with another person, the small resentments that accumulate if you don't clear them, the moments of silence that mean something is wrong, but no one has said it yet. The way another person's needs can feel like demands on days when you are already running short. They had those days. They were not always graceful on those days. There were evenings where one of them went to bed without the conversation being finished, and mornings where the unfinished thing sat at the table with them until someone decided to pick it up. Nathan had a bad stretch in the second January, when his knee became genuinely problematic and he couldn't do the work he was used to doing at the pace he was used to doing it, and it made him angry in the low, quiet way that was harder to address than open anger would have been. He didn't take it out on her directly. He just got very still and very contained, and she watched him recede in a way she recognized from the stories Harriet had told, and she made a decision not to let it go the way it had gone before. "Nathan," she said one evening when he was sitting at the table with the ledger open and not actually looking at it. "Yeah. Tell me what's happening." He looked up. "I'm going through the ledger. You've been on the same page for 40 minutes. He was quiet. "Your knee's not going to be like this forever," she said. "The doc said it's the winter swelling. It'll come back." "I know what the doc said." "Then why are you sitting there like it's over?" He closed the ledger and looked at her with the direct expression that meant he was going to say something real. "Because I'm 57 years old, and my knee decides half of what I can do in a given day, and there are things on this property that need doing that I can't do right now. And you're picking up the difference without saying a word about it, and I hate that. I hate being the reason you're working harder." She sat down across from him. You want me to say a word about it? I want you to not have to, he said. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. She looked at him. I picked up the difference because it needed doing and I could do it. That's not a burden. It's just work. You've done the same for me a dozen times. It's not the same. Why not? He didn't answer that. Because you think there's a version of this where you should always be the one carrying more, she said. Because you're older, or because you're a man, or because you feel like you owe me something for choosing you. She kept her voice steady. Nathan, I don't need you to be more than you are. I need you to be here. That's the whole thing. He looked at her across the table in the January kitchen, the fire going properly because he had learned that she kept it warmer than he did, and he had adjusted, and she watched something in him relax that had been held tight for weeks. I'm not going anywhere, he said. It sounded like it was as much to himself as to her. Good, she said, because I've got fence work tomorrow and I'd rather have help. He was out at the fence with her by 8 the next morning, knee brace on, working at a modified pace that was still more useful than no one. She didn't comment on the brace or the pace. She just handed him things when he needed them and worked beside him, and by noon the section was done, and they ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of the wagon in the January cold, passing a thermos of coffee back and forth, not talking much, which was the best kind of not talking. She found out she was pregnant in March of their second year. She stood in the kitchen with the knowledge of it for about an hour before she told him, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she needed the hour for herself, to sit with what it meant and what it was going to change and whether she was ready for it. The answer to the last question was she didn't know, which she decided was probably honest and probably sufficient. When she told him, he was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet she had learned to wait through without filling. You're sure? He said. I'm sure. He sat down in the chair nearest him, not dramatically, just sat and put his hands flat on the table the way he did when he was steadying something inside himself. Nathan, she said carefully, say what you're thinking. He looked up at her. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that I'm 57 years old and I'm going to be a father again, and I don't know if I'm... He stopped. I raised a version of this fear before, with Margaret. We tried, and it didn't come. And then she was gone, and I thought that was the end of it, and I made my peace with the end of it. He looked at his hands. I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I'm going to be good at it. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and looked at him directly. You fixed Cody Marsh's wagon wheel last October, she said, for free. He had no one to call, and you drove out there and came back 3 hours later and didn't mention it. He frowned slightly. That's different. You sat with old Ben Marsh for 2 hours when his wife died, and you didn't say much, but you were there, and he told Ruth Aldridge it was the thing that got him through that week. Eliza, you have been showing up for people your whole life, she said, quietly, without making a performance of it. That's what this is going to ask of you. Not perfection, just showing up. He was quiet again. I know you're scared, she said. I'm scared too. That doesn't mean we're wrong. He looked at her for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the March wind was pushing at the new grass, and the mountains were still snow-capped, and the combined property stretched out in both directions. The land they had redrawn together, the fields that held both their histories in the soil. I'm not going to be able to run after a child the way a younger man could, he said. Then you'll be there when they get back, she said. That counts for more. He breathed out slowly, and she saw the fear not disappear. It didn't disappear. It was not that kind of moment, but settle into something he was going to carry rather than let stop him. All right, he said. All right, she said. The baby came in October, on a cold morning that started before the sun. Nathan was there for all of it, in the way that mattered. Not capable of doing anything useful during the hardest parts, but present, holding her hand with both of his and not looking away, which was what she had needed and had not known how to ask for. The midwife, a practical woman named Clara, who had been delivering babies in Durango for 20 years, said afterward that she had seen a lot of men in that room over the years, and Nathan Cole was one of the better ones, which she said not as a compliment but as an assessment, which made it mean more. They named her June for the month they had decided to do everything right. It was Nathan's suggestion, offered quietly the evening after she was born. When the three of them were in the bedroom in the lamplight, and Eliza was exhausted and the baby was asleep on her chest, and Nathan was sitting in the chair beside the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at them both with an expression she had no name for. "June," she repeated. "The survey map," he said. "The kitchen table." She looked at him. "You remember the exact month?" "I remember everything," he said simply. She looked down at the baby and thought about the survey map on the table in the June evening, and Nathan saying he'd like to do it right, and she thought that this was the kind of thing that doesn't look like a turning point when it happens, but turns out to be the exact moment everything changed, and you only know it in retrospect, when the life you're living shows you what that moment was the beginning of. "June," she said again. "All right." The first months with June were the hardest and the most ordinary thing Eliza had ever experienced simultaneously. The baby did not care about the ranch schedule or the cattle or the fence line or whether her parents had gotten any sleep. She cared about being fed and held and about the particular sound of Nathan's voice, which she seemed to respond to from very early on, going still when he talked in that low, unhurried way of his, which Eliza found both useful and slightly unfair. She watched him figure it out the way she had watched him figure out everything, not fast, not smooth, but with a persistent attention that eventually became competence. He held June with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that he was holding something that required everything he had. He got up at night more than she expected him to, more than she asked him to, moving quietly through the dark house in a way that told her he had been awake anyway and was glad to have something useful to do with the sleeplessness. He talked to the baby while he worked, narrating whatever he was doing in a low, steady voice, checking the stock, looking at the accounts, fixing the gate latch that had been sticking, and June listened with the gravity of a person taking notes. By spring, she was sitting up and watching the horses from the porch rail where Nathan held her, and by summer, she was pulling herself upright on anything she could reach and moving through the house with the focused determination that told Eliza she was, without question, her mother's daughter. Nathan watched all of this with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of joy. Not loud, not demonstrative, just very present, very still, like a man who is trying to memorize something and is aware of the gift of being given the chance. Durango eventually did what Durango always did, which was absorb the new thing into its working sense of itself. Eliza and Nathan Cole became a known quantity, which in a small Colorado town means you stop being a topic and start being a feature of the landscape. Agnes Porter admired June in the dry goods store one afternoon with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, and said nothing else about the situation, which Eliza accepted as the closest thing to a retraction Agnes was constitutionally capable of offering. Ruth Aldridge said, over pie in the Aldridge kitchen one November afternoon, "I want you to know that when you turned down Daniel Grant, I thought you were making a mistake." Eliza looked at her. "I know you did." "I was wrong," Ruth said, "not because Nathan is who he is, but because you knew what was true for you and you didn't let us talk you out of it. That's harder than it sounds." "It is," Eliza agreed. "Most people let themselves get talked out of it," Ruth said. "They take the easier story and they spend the next 30 years quietly sorry about it." She refilled the coffee. "I think that's what Agnes is angry about, if I'm honest. Not you." Herself. Eliza thought about that later, riding back across the property in the late November light. She thought about the version of herself that might have taken the easier story, the socially approved version, the one that made arithmetic sense on paper. She thought about what that life would have looked like. Not bad, she admitted to herself honestly. It would not have been a bad life. Daniel Grant would have been good to her. The town would have been satisfied. She would have built something real with him. But it would not have been true. And she had known, from the first time she crossed 2 pastures in the dark with a pot of food and knocked on Nathan Cole's fence post and walked away without waiting for thanks, that she was a person for whom the true thing and the easy thing were not always the same, and that she was going to have to choose between them, and that she was going to choose the true thing every time, whatever it cost. The November she turned 28, June was a year old and walking with the aggressive confidence of a child who has decided that falling is a temporary condition rather than a deterrent. Nathan was 58 and his knee was better than it had been the previous winter, and he had a new hired hand named Ellis who was 22 and worked hard and asked questions, which Nathan answered with a patience she had not necessarily predicted, but should have. She came in from the barn one evening to find Nathan at the kitchen table with June on his knee, going through the ledger the way he always went through the ledger in the evenings, running the numbers on the combined operation with the deliberate attention he gave to anything that mattered. June was chewing on the corner of his collar and watching the pages turn with an expression of tremendous seriousness, and Nathan was accounting for both activities simultaneously without apparent difficulty. He looked up when she came in. "Good day?" he said. "Productive," she said. Ellis found the problem with the east trough. It was the fitting, not the pipe. "I thought it was the fitting." "You thought correctly." She poured herself water and leaned against the counter and watched him. Her husband, her partner, the man who had been standing across 2 pastures from her for 3 years before either of them had the sense to do anything about it. "What are you two doing?" "Accounts," he said. "She's helping." "She's eating your collar." "She's multitasking," he said. June chose this moment to look up at her mother with the round-faced solemnity of a 1-year-old who has recently discovered that she has parents and finds this arrangement satisfactory. She had Nathan's eyes, which Eliza had not expected and had not been able to stop noticing since the first week. She sat down at the table across from them, and Nathan slid the ledger toward her so she could see the numbers, and they went through it together the way they went through everything now, both of them looking at the same thing, making the same calls, responsible for the same outcomes. The operation was stronger than it had been when they ran their 2 properties separately. That was not a feeling or a hope. It was in the numbers, in the increased yield, in the water access that no longer cost either of them in dry months, in the fence lines that held because 2 people maintained them instead of 1. After June went to sleep, which she did with the sudden completeness of small children, as if a switch had been thrown, Nathan sat on the porch with his coffee, and Eliza sat beside him, and they looked out at the property in the dark. The mountains were just shapes against the sky, enormous and patient, doing what they always did. "I keep thinking about something," Nathan said. "What?" He was quiet for a moment. "About how close I came to not being here." She waited. "Not dramatically," he said. "I wasn't going to leave. I was just going to stay on my side of the fence until it seemed like enough." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Keep being your neighbor. Keep washing the pots. Keep convincing myself I was doing the right thing by keeping the distance." "You almost did," she said. "I know." He looked out at the dark fields. "I had myself pretty well persuaded that you deserved better, that the arithmetic was the whole story." He stopped. "I did the math on everything except the thing that mattered." "What thing?" He looked at her. In the dark, his face was mostly shadow, and the lines around his eyes were not visible, and she could see the younger version of the man he had been somewhere in there, and the older version he was becoming, and she did not mind either of them. "That you don't get the life back that you didn't live," he said. "That's the arithmetic nobody does until it's too late to matter." She sat with that. "I almost calculated myself out of this," he said. It was a plain statement, no self-pity in it, just the honest accounting of a man who understood what he had come close to losing by deciding in advance that he didn't deserve it. Out of her. He meant June. Out of all of it. She reached over and put her hand on his where it rested on the porch rail, and he turned his hand over and held hers, easy and warm, the grip of a man who had stopped treating the things he loved like things he might be asked to give back. "But you didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." They sat there a while longer, the Colorado night doing what it did, the stars coming out in the way they come out at elevation. Not gradually, but all at once, as if they had been there the whole time and only needed the dark to be visible. The horses moved in the paddock. Somewhere on the north section, one of the cattle made a low sound and then went quiet. She thought about what she would tell June someday, when June was old enough to ask how it had happened, how they had found each other, how it had started, what it had taken. She thought she would tell her the truth, which was that it had not started with any single moment, but with a lot of ordinary ones. A pot of food on a fence post, a fence line walked at sunrise, a piece of flashing brought across a field on a cold afternoon. That the real things don't usually announce themselves. They just keep showing up, Tuesday after Tuesday, until one day you look up and realize that the person who has been there all along is the one you were looking for. She would tell her that choosing what is true over what is easy is not a one-time act. It's every day. It's the Tuesday you don't feel like cooking and you cook anyway. It's the January night you stay instead of going quiet. It's the survey map on the kitchen table that says out loud what two people have been circling for 3 years. She would tell her that her father had almost decided he didn't deserve it, and that he had been wrong about that, and that being wrong about it was the best thing that had ever happened to either of them. Nathan finished his coffee and set the cup down and leaned back in the chair with the ease of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, to stop sitting at the edge of things. The mountains held their positions in the dark. The land stretched out around them, redrawn and shared and productive and real. June slept in the house behind them with Nathan's eyes and Eliza's stubbornness and a whole life in front of her that neither of them could predict, and both of them were going to show up for, without fail, for every year they were given. That was the whole of it. Not more than that, and not less.